Hello all, Old Geek here, and in this video I'll be talking about something that has slowly become standard in our weekend OSE games. Now, for those who don't know OSE, it's Old School Essentials, a basic and expert D&D retro clone which contains optional elements of AD&D, and everything is neatly packaged in a no-nonsense manner with minimal fluff. Of all the retro clones that I've seen, it's right up there with the best. We recently discussed house rules on a live stream, a Wednesday night live stream, so it's an opportune moment now to give details of one of ours and go through the reasons for using it. The house rule relates to ability checks. Now, thinking back to when I started playing D&D back in the early 1980s, all of our games featured ability checks. By that I mean if a character attempts something that is not specifically detailed by a game rule, then they roll against a relevant ability score. And if they roll equal to or lower than that ability score, then they succeed. They fail if they roll above. Such checks were so common that I grew up assuming that they were defined in a rulebook somewhere. And when I came back to the hobby, I tried looking this up, focusing on AD&D 1E because that was my main game. But it was only ever mentioned in passing. A few modules had an ability check rule for specific instances, but as a codified rule in the books, it wasn't there. No defined dice to roll, no example checks or modifiers. I do remember something being mentioned in passing in one of the Beckme books, but it was only ever in passing. The first we saw of any form of codification of ability checks was in Oriental Adventures and the two survival guides that came out for 1E in the mid 1980s, as they introduced non-weapon proficiencies. And while I liked those at the time, as the intention was to use them to flesh out the character, I don't like them nowadays. Because even though it wasn't their intention, they typically had the opposite effect. They felt they led players to limit their focus. Let me explain my point here. How many times did we see players making checks for something along the lines of fire building if they had the proficiency, with the assumption that if the character did not have the specific proficiency to build a fire, then they couldn't do it? And that is an incorrect assumption. It's incorrect application, as the non-weapon proficiencies were supposed to be reserved for challenging situations, but so many of us ignored that. Take that fire building one, for example. A group of adventurers on a dry summer's evening in a forest can collect up firewood and make a fire. They do not need to make a roll. There's no need to fall back on any form of check. They can just do it. They're adventurers. They're used to the outside world. Where the check is useful is where there is doubt or pressure on the situation or suboptimal conditions. It's raining, it's exceptionally cold, the only wood that is available is damp, or there is a time pressure. That sort of thing. But all too often I saw at the table, we need to make a fire. Who's got fire building? Roll it. It happens. We know it happens. You all saw it happen. Now, I've grown to prefer the AD&D approach to skills, in inverted commas. There was a table in the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide with a list of background professions. You roll on the table to get an indicator of what your profession was before you were an adventurer, and you just wing it from there. If your character had been a carpenter, then he or she could fix a table more easily than a character without that experience. A cook might be able to judge the quality of food. A fur trader might know the value of rare furs, and so on. And while these were less defined than the non-weapon proficiencies, much less codified, they actually feel less constrained in play and much more natural. The players use the environment to come up with the justifications in line with whatever the profession may have been. It's, as I said, a more natural approach to gaming. Okay, with that bit of background out of the way, how is our Saturday game, which is played over Discord with multiple DMs, drop in, drop out. We use Albert Rodeo and Roll20 for various visual depictions and so on. Come and join in if you feel like it. It's just relaxed gaming. No stress, no fuss, no pressures. Sorry, that was a quick shield for the channel. Now, back to the point. What is our house rule? How are we dealing with the idea of ability checks in that game? OSE has a background profession table, much akin to the one in the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide. It may have come from BX as well. I don't know the BX rulebooks as well, because I had BECME, my version of BASIC, when I was younger. 1983 is when I started. We roll on that table, and here's one of my characters. This is Yogi. He is a first level dwarven fighter, and for him I rolled Bookbinder. Bookbinder here. And yes, look at that intelligence and wisdom. So naturally he's adventuring because his family trade, bookbinding, was not for him. But still, if it does so happen to crop up in game that some knowledge of book manufacture might be useful, then he's got that to fall back on. Yes, he'll have to make his check against that poor intelligence or wisdom, but so he's got a chance. Give him a chance. Hint, hint, DMs, Gene, Gingerbeard. And now on screen, here's the default OSE rule for ability checks. Roll 1d20, equal to or under the relevant ability score is a success. It's probably the most common method of making such a check throughout the ages of gaming. I remember this, though I will say I leant in the 80s towards using 3d6. I'm going to come to that. A d20 is very swingy. I've accepted its use, but I've never really liked it. I preferred using multiple d6s. So I was very happy when one of the other OSE DMs in our games stated that he did so too. Stats in OSE are created using 3d6 in order, and that is how I made Yogi. When you create your character, you can modify your prime requisite stat up by 1 point for every 2 points that you take off your strength, intelligence or wisdom, and you can't drop any stat below 9. Thus Yogi was rolled as you see him. His intelligence and wisdom were already too low to adjust. That's the way the dice fall. So with 3d6 and its bell curve creating the stats, a basic ability check made using 3d6 makes sense. The bell curve probabilities work, and I believe it gives greater value to a stat. Because if you think the bell curve is like that, and if you're on the steeper points, 1 point difference in a stat is more meaningful. So, over the last few months, we've been using d6s, multiple d6s, for ability checks in our OSE game. It's our house rule, and now with that campaign several months old and the rule proving to be smooth and intuitive, I'm just going to run through some general ideas about codifying it. And here's my proposal, and this is something I'd like to see all our DMs in our game use in some way. Ability checks are only made when there is a chance of failure, and the consequences for that failure are meaningful. Try to start a campfire on a pleasant evening with dry wood, no roll, you do it. If it's cold and wet, and or the wood supply is inadequate in any way, make a roll. I suggest the default number of dice to roll be 4d6. Yes, that immediately puts the PCs at a slight disadvantage, but if one of the party members is an outdoors type, an elf, a ranger, or maybe they rolled lumberjack or forester or something like that on the background table, whichever ones are on there. Then they roll 1 or even maybe 2d6 fewer. If the PC is a dwarf warrior who has spent his life mining or binding books, they roll extra d6. Which stat to use for this? Well, in this instance, either intelligence or wisdom can make sense. You choose. Poor Yogi would need to roll 8 or lower, probably on 5d6, to build a successful campfire in the rain. He's going to struggle. Whereas Wheat, an elven ranger played by Nosorian, one of our channel regulars, would succeed by rolling either under his intelligence or wisdom on 3d6, or maybe even 2d6 depending on the circumstances, which of course could mean an automatic success if intelligence or wisdom are 12 or higher. And there's not a problem with that. It means the character knows what he's doing in those conditions and succeeds. There we go. Character feels important and useful. Constiturum, a human magic user played by Sean, would probably have to roll 4d6, depending on background and other environmental effects. And that seems fair. A DM also has the opportunity to take into account difficulty by adding or subtracting extra d6s as they please. Yogi might have to roll 6d6 on some occasions. So what? This system is fast, it's intuitive, it requires no bookkeeping, and it makes players put value in the intelligence and wisdom stats, which, while useful when making PCs and if relevant to experience and prime requisite bonuses come into effect, they do tend to fall a little bit behind the other character stats when actually playing old school versions of D&D. Strength is useful in nearly all fights. Dexterity boosts armor class and helps with individual initiative if you're playing individual initiative. Constitution, hit points. Hit points are key in old school versions of D&D, especially at low levels. And charisma, well, we use reaction rolls. Reaction rolls are being done all the time. I use them often behind the scenes. And yes, those stats, strength, dexterity, constitution and charisma, can be used for some ability checks. But with the game already having mechanics in place that make frequent use of them, such as open doors checks, I feel we are more likely to lean on intelligence and wisdom more when making ability checks in this manner. And that's a good thing. There were probably more than a few of you still thinking, well, why deviate from the standard simple 1d20? Well, here's another reason. I've already mentioned the fact that the d20 is swingy. Any single dice is. The odds are equal across the range of results. This means the extremes are equally as likely as the middle. The perfect Superman roll is just as common as a Benny Hill style comic catastrophe. Thus the game is more likely to lurch from one extreme to another than if you use some bell curve related method. Using multiple dice means that range concentrates towards that middle, increasing the frequency of the middling results and reducing the frequency of extremes. OSE is a lower powered game than, for example, 5th edition. The characters are not comic superheroes, and I feel the action of dragging results towards that centre ground better fits the intended feel of a game system such as OSE. Well, aren't single dice just simpler, faster, easier? Well, the games we play, we use Albert Rodeo or Roll20 for dice rolling. And this house rule is for our online games. Both of those systems, both of those programs, calculate the total of the dice that you roll automatically. So no, rolling a fistful of d6s is no slower or more complicated than rolling a d20 if you use Albert Rodeo or Roll20. There's no mental arithmetic involved whatsoever. It's incredibly easy. So this, for us, is a perfect example of a house rule. It suits the system, it suits the game environment, it suits the way we play, and it improves the game for us. Well, a quick rundown of one of our house rules, including justification for using it, which is required when you make a house rule. I hope you liked the video. I've been the Old Geek. See ya.